The Ayatollah is dead and the regime is changing before our eyes. Iran is going through the one thing the Islamic Republic was built to prevent: a decapitation strike that removed the supreme leader and shattered the image of control at the top. The death of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has triggered the most dangerous political transition that Iran has faced since 1979. This is because the regime's legitimacy is designed to flow downward from one office. Israel and the United States can plausibly argue that they have already achieved both the hardest and the easiest part of regime change by removing the apex and thinning the inner circle, but that does not automatically produce a new positive regime. And I say it's the hardest part because the whole of Iran is designed to protect the Ayatollah, but it's also paradoxically the easiest part because of what comes next, which is what we're talking about in this video. What happens now depends less on airstrikes and more on whether Iran's coercive institutions can stay cohesive, whether the succession process produces a stabilizing deal, and whether the streets ignite at a scale the system cannot kill off again. Iran's decapitation is proof that the regime's defenses were weaker than it originally projected. A strike that reaches the supreme leader is not just a tactical success for the US and Israel. It is a strategic message that the Iranian state cannot fully protect the people at the very top, even from its greatest enemy. The killing triggered a high-stakes succession race and the gravest crisis since the revolution. Even though the top leadership has and still is being culled, Iran has plenty of offensive capacity and has used it extensively around the region. And this is something that we're going to discuss in more detail in a future video. Still, the message to what remains of the regime is clear, and the paranoia that's likely to be felt by all may make things even more unpredictable. This was possible now because pressure on Iran's leadership has been growing for years, and war compresses mistakes all into just one moment. A leadership system that survives sanctions and protests can still fail if it loses security predictability at the top. Decapitation works politically when it destroys that level of predictability and security, because elites start calculating for personal survival instead of loyalty to the top in the regime. This is why the regime's real vulnerability is not just the single person dying, it is the sudden uncertainty about who controls the coercive machine that is the Islamic Republic. Iran's constitution has a process for this kind of thing, but Iran's power has never been purely constitutional. The formal mechanism centers on a temporary leadership arrangement and then selection by the Assembly of Experts. The Assembly of Experts is an 88-member clerical body whose job is to select the next supreme leader, and on paper, it is the institution that chooses who is the leader. In reality, succession is usually managed by bargaining among power brokers within the Assembly of Experts, and that means the IRGC and security networks matter at least as much as the clerics do. The succession machine that we've just described is also already moving. Ayatollah Reza Arafi was named the temporary supreme leader by the Transitional Council before he himself was killed in an airstrike. There hasn't been a new temporary supreme leader named since that I've seen, but if there is one by the time I post this video, I'll try to post it here. CFR's transition analysis stresses that the system deliberately diffuses power, which helps Iran survive shocks, but also makes the bargaining phase more opaque and potentially more vicious. The messaging of calmness is part of this fight, because perception, especially in a time like this, is how the regime balances both the onslaught of US and Israeli airstrikes and the looming revolution from within the country. This is where the project of regime change begins to split into two clean halves, and only one half has already been completed. The half that's already been achieved is real and notable. Removing the supreme leader and thinning the top tier leadership is a major accomplishment. The hardest part hasn't yet been achieved though, and that is installing a democratic alternative. That requires both control on the ground, unity among opposition forces, and security forces that either defect or quit, which cannot easily be dictated from the air. Even sympathetic analysts to this operation warn that airstrikes alone are unlikely to produce regime change because outcomes hinge on elite dynamics and coercive institutions like the IRGC and the besieged, not just the destroyed targets of the Navy and the ballistic missile fleet. If the goal is a different Iran, then that's already been achieved, and the question becomes who fills the vacuum and who's actually able to govern the Iran state. But the answer to that question may not necessarily be a good thing for anyone. Iran is not just a hollow regime waiting for one push. It is a layered system with the IRGC at its core and multiple institutions that keep the lights on while leadership changes. That structure makes decapitation disruptive, but it also makes the regime very hard to dislodge because there are many layers of redundancy and insurance. If the IRGC stays cohesive, the most likely near-term outcome is not a democracy. It's consolidation under a new figurehead, likely somebody with even more radical and emboldened ideas. This takes us to several uncontrolled variables that will make or break this entire operation of regime change for the US and Israel. And note that this is a very fluid situation. Some details are likely to change even after I've posted this video, and that the stated goal for the United States, at least according to statements by President Trump and Marco Rubio, indicate that regime change really isn't the ultimate goal of this operation, but that is in direct contrast to leaked statements from members of the Israeli government who seem to be focused on some sort of regime change. However, these uncontrolled variables are things that by definition neither the US or Israel can control, especially if the war stays constrained to just aerial bombing. The first variable is the protest movement. It's not enough to just want a revolution, it needs to happen and it needs to be fostered and developed in a way that is more significant than what has happened since 1979. The New Year's protests show that Iran can face nationwide unrest and that the movement crosses classes and regions, but it was still suppressed through excessive violence. Over 30,000 people died with over 300,000 wounded and several tens of thousands arrested, and those are considered to be conservative estimates just basing from outside of Iran. A protest movement becomes a revolution only when it sustains its momentum, fractures the coercive apparatus within the IRGC, namely the Basij, and produces an alternative authority or governance structure that people can actually trust. And that's the hardest part, and today we haven't seen that, either from within Iran or from outside Iran, beyond the son of the Shah, which isn't really a completely legitimate option for a number of reasons. The second uncontrolled variable is infighting among the elite, which can lead to more extreme and emboldened successors. Succession tempts hardliners to lock in control, because uncertainty is when institutions grab more autonomy and begin to purge rivals. Reuters notes the IRGC's centrality and the risk of ideological shifts, which is a polite way of saying that the next leadership could be more radical and even more militarized. If factions in Iran believe that survival requires escalation, the post-Khamenei Iran could become less predictable even if it becomes more disciplined. The third uncontrolled variable is the limit of coercion from the air, because air power breaks things, but it does not run a country. Airstrikes can degrade capabilities and remove leadership, but they cannot administer cities, stabilize factional competition, or secure weapons stockpiles across a large, angry country. The Pentagon is already trying to reassure the public that this is not just another endless war, while also admitting objectives will take time and not ruling out future deployments of ground troops, which is the classic sign of mission creep. Should the US deploy ground troops, it'll take more than just special forces to topple the regime and replace it with a favorable alternative. And the more unstable things get, the more challenging it'll be to control the direction of the war and push it in the right path. The fourth variable is that ground operation question, because regime change without boots is usually just some form of punishment. Even if nobody wants an Iraq-style occupation and invasion, limited ground operations exist on a spectrum, which includes special forces raids, seizure of specific facilities, border operations, or partnering with local forces, or fostering some sort of revolutionary movement. There's also the question of what those troops do both before and after the regime fall. You can have special forces generate a revolution enabled by air power to topple the regime, but Libya is a clear example of the potential chaos that can come next if a strong and credible successor government isn't able to immediately take and consolidate full control. Even with a larger and more sustained ground occupation, Iraq tells a very similar story. The key point is not whether a ground operation is announced, it's whether the air campaign creates problems that can only be solved by physical control, which, for the purpose of regime change, has already happened. Once ground control becomes an implied requirement, the political appetite in Washington and the risk tolerance in Jerusalem becomes decisive constraints. And that leads directly into political will at home in the US, because this administration promised peace and did not start what it called dumb forever wars. And now the US is in what some believe to be a dumb war that could go on forever that it started. Now granted, I think that the forever war critique of this conflict is stupid. It's only, a week old? Russia and Ukraine has been going into year 5, and that is still not considered a forever war, compared to other conflicts that even the US has fought in this century. A Washington Post flash poll described majority opposition to strikes and widespread concern about sliding into a full-scale war, which is the opposite of a mandate for a long-term campaign. Reuters reported the Pentagon explicitly pushed back on the endless war framing while acknowledging that the operation is ongoing and complex, which is the admission that time horizons are not yet clean. And it's good that they're being transparent about this kind of thing, but when we have a population that lacks the ability to handle nuance, well, that's where we're going to have these kinds of critiques. If casualties rise or objectives remain vague, domestic support will become a fuse, not a foundation, and that is something that Iran can actually exploit. The next constraint is global bandwidth, because the US power is indeed finite, and high-end munitions are the real bottleneck that are of concern here. CSIS has detailed how missile defense interceptor inventories can deplete quickly and how demand is shaped by multiple theaters at once, which matters when Iran is firing large volleys of ballistic missiles and the Indo-Pacific is still watching. The strategic reality is that interceptors used to defend bases in the Middle East are in the same scarce asset category that planners worry about for other contingencies, especially Iran. When Beijing sees US stockpiles strain and attention begin to split, it affects deterrence calculations even if nobody says it out loud. And to be fair, they also have to pair that assessment with the rapid and massive success of US intelligence and air power over Iran, where it's defeated both Russian and Chinese-made air defense systems en masse. Now zoom out to the strategic endgame, because what the US and Israel want is not exactly a single or unified thing, and it likely never was from the jump. Reuters reported US objectives described in military terms like dismantling Iran's missile and naval capabilities, while the political conversation publicly circles around regime change, and those goals do not perfectly align at all. Israel's near-term interest is a degraded Iranian war machine and a broken command network that cannot regenerate quickly, because that reduces the threat regardless of who sits on the throne. Washington's near-term interest is often framed as preventing Iran from projecting power and stabilizing the region's escalation. However, there is the temptation to treat this as a once-in-a-generation moment to reshape Iran. Here's the hard truth that makes this moment so dangerous. Decapitation creates opportunity and chaos all at the same time. You can't control chaos without boots on the ground and a very clear plan that you're capable of completing. It creates opportunity because the regime is off balance, elites are bargaining and infighting, and the Iranian public sees vulnerability at the top. But it also creates chaos because insecurity pushes institutions like the IRGC to prioritize control, and control, especially in Iran, does not look like liberalization or surrender. It also creates additional risk because an outside air campaign can accelerate internal fragmentization without being able to shape or control what replaces it. So what happens to Iran now is not a single storyline. It is a collision between succession, coercion, and popular pressure. Iran's next supreme leader could be weaker, which might empower institutions to create a more collective leadership model, or it could be harder or more extreme, which might push Iran towards more overt security rule into the very things that the US and Israel are trying to prevent, like nuclear weapons. The protest movement could surge, but success depends on organization, endurance, and whether the security forces begin to crack and not just simply hope. And what the protest movement really needs is to be armed and trained to fight, and that inherently requires boots on the ground to help foster that movement, whether those boots are American boots or somebody else. And from what we've seen, it looks like the Kurds might just be some of those boots, but it's not going to be nearly enough. The US and Israel can keep shaping the battlefield from the air, but they cannot dictate political outcomes inside Iran unless they accept the risks and costs of deeper involvement. Iran's future is being forged under intense pressure. If the regime stabilizes, which is unlikely unless the US and Israel quit too early, it will likely do so by tightening, purging, and centralizing coercion of the population, because that is what insecure political systems do. If the regime fractures, the most dangerous period is the in-between, when nobody is fully in charge. This outcome looks more like 2005 Iraq or the post-Gaddafi Libya. In either case, if the US is going to do what it's set out to do, it will need to do more than just airstrikes alone. but it'll have to do those things when doing it could not be more politically unpopular. And at a time when the administration is already facing growing unpopularity and midterms this year that nobody expects to go well. So it's ultimately a race against time to enable the Iranian people to take this whole thing on themselves. But there's no clear or publicly articulated plan on how exactly that's going to happen. That's why this ultimately may be an actually dumb war, because it's not necessarily the wrong thing to do. The Iranian regime is evil, and it's a good thing that the Ayatollah is gone. But because it's being done in a half-baked, impatient, and ineffective way that could just replace evil with even more evil. Trump can wave the mission accomplished flag in a way because he already got the Ayatollah, but if he doesn't change things, he risks charting the exact same path as Bush did in Iraq even after he waved his mission accomplished flag, albeit fortunately without US boots on the ground to absorb the blow. Now, there's a lot more to analyze with Iran, especially from before the war, but that are mattering even more now than ever. And I already have a 7-part series that analyzes Iran from all the different types of domains that you really would care about. Check it out in this playlist. Like this video if you found it helpful or interesting. I'll see y'all next time. Later.